Well, March 1st was the first day of what's known as meteorological spring. We're still about another week away before temperatures in many parts of the state tick up closer to where we'd expect them to be. So it's safe to say the 2018-2019 winter season will go down as one we're going to remember. One reason for the cold, and you've probably heard this weather term before, the polar vortex. I spoke with DTN senior ag meteorologist Bryce about that and other agricultural impacts from this harsh winter.
Well, the polar vortex is basically a description for just a real cold bubble of air that from time to time breaks away from the Arctic region during a winter when the prevailing winds at the high latitudes are a little bit weaker than typical, and we had that happen here during this winter. That cold air plunged southward, and it certainly led to a very harsh cold wave during the end of January and the first part of February over the eastern half of the U.S. And in our opinion, the focus of that cold air bubble has now moved to the western part of North America, and it's stayed around through much of the last couple weeks to where we had cold enough conditions that it snowed in Las Vegas, Nevada, and even around Phoenix, Arizona over the last 10 days or so. And that's helped to drive more winter storms pretty much across the central and eastern parts of the country. So it's had a real lasting effect on our winter patterns so far, and it's kept things on a mighty cold note throughout the last half of the season.
And what are the impacts agriculture has seen and will see from it?
Well, I think that we've seen certainly a real harsh effect on transportation. It has affected this cold and the winter wind conditions and winter storm conditions. Snowfall and freezing precip have all combined to hurt the transportation scene. We've seen some local areas where the cash grain basis has had to strengthen because simply of a lack of available grain, and so it's been more difficult from that side of things with keeping grain transport going. But then also the impact on livestock has been, I think, quite terrific. I've visited with livestock producers in the plains who've had just a terrible winter, relatively speaking, in terms of feed conversion for feedlot cattle because it's been cold and wet. And now we get into spring calving season or late winter spring calving time frame, and that's been a very stressful time as well because it simply has been cold, windy, wet, snowy, and that's caused issues from that standpoint. Along with that, Troy, it's interesting to note that, you know, the hay supply from last year has really been drawn down quite substantially by this cold weather. And so as a result, when we come into the springtime here in 2019, there's not quite as much hay available as one might think of because there's been a lot of hay that's had to have been fed over quite a large area because it's been so cold.
And Bryce, I know a big question people are asking is, when is this going to let up? Because I know field work is something that is on people's minds over the coming weeks. So what news do you have for them?
The scenario is not looking too favorable for just a complete turnaround in this weather pattern over the next couple weeks at least. Our forecasts have a definite below normal trend on the temperature outlook all the way into the March 10th weekend time frame. Now, during the last half of March, it does appear that the pattern is going to modify a little bit, but it's still going to be pretty slow. I mean, when we get this kind of a cold pattern set in late winter, and then when we add the kind of snowfall that we've seen to that, I mean, we've had record or near record amounts of snow for the entire winter season in much of eastern Nebraska because of this late winter snow that we've had. That takes time to melt, and obviously that then takes time for the temperature pattern to moderate a little bit. And so it does mean that winter is going to hang on and spring is going to be a slow season to actually begin. It's going to be a very reluctant transition from winter to spring this year.
And since we've had a lot of snow on top of already wet soil, do you think flooding will be a concern once we warm up?
I think flooding concern is very high, and flood risk is higher than average. It certainly is just a lot higher than a year ago. When we're looking at soil moisture profiles, all the way from the Central Plains in Nebraska and Kansas east clear to the New Jersey coastline. So we're talking about much of the plains and just about all of the Midwest. The soil moisture supplies are at close to the 99th percentile over this entire part of the continental U.S. And so that means that the soil moisture situation is already almost at saturation level. And now we add to it a very heavy snowpack, and add to that the likelihood of some springtime rains, which is a pretty good bet at this point. I think that we are going to see a notable round of flooding this season, and it could be quite severe depending on how the snow melt acts. If we get a lot of melting of snow before the ground completely thaws and is able to have that moisture percolate into the soils, we're going to see a pretty notable round of flooding, and I think that is a much higher risk this year.